In a world where first impressions can be deceiving, sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the most extraordinary secrets. What happens when a seemingly ordinary nurse's past collides with her present in the most unexpected way? When military precision meets medical compassion, and when silence speaks louder than any words ever could, lives can change in an instant. This is the story of how one woman's hidden identity transformed not just her own destiny, but the fate of everyone around her, proving that heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they simply show up for their shift, ready to save lives in ways no one could ever imagine. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across the break room as Sarah Martinez quietly sipped her coffee. It was her third week at the prestigious medical facility, and already the whispers followed her wherever she went. The other nurses had made their opinions clear from day one. She was too quiet, too reserved, too different from the chatty, social butterfly types they were used to working with. "I heard she barely speaks during shift change," Lisa, one of the senior nurses, whispered to her colleague near the vending machine. "How are we supposed to trust someone who won't even participate in basic communication?" Sarah kept her eyes fixed on her coffee cup, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times since arriving at St. Mary's. The irony wasn't lost on her that these same people who questioned her silence had no idea that she had once coordinated life and death missions where a single word spoken at the wrong moment could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. At 28 years old, Sarah possessed an unusual combination of skills that made her both an exceptional nurse and a mystery to her colleagues. Her medical training was impeccable, her technique flawless, and her ability to remain calm under pressure was unmatched. Yet she moved through the hospital corridors like a ghost, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and keeping her personal life completely private. Dr. Amanda Chun, the emergency department's chief resident, had noticed Sarah's unique approach from the beginning. Unlike the other nurses who seemed to have opinions about everything and everyone, Sarah simply did her job with a precision that bordered on the military. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way she assessed situations, and the way she seemed to anticipate problems before they arose that set her apart from every other nurse Dr. Chun had ever worked with. "Sarah, room 7 needs a blood pressure check," Dr. Chun called out during the busy afternoon shift. Without a word, Sarah nodded and moved toward the room with the fluid grace of someone who had been trained to move efficiently and silently. She completed the task in record time, documenting everything with meticulous attention to detail that impressed even the most experienced doctors on staff. The emergency department at St. Mary's was known for its high-stress environment and demanding pace. Located in the heart of downtown, the hospital served a diverse population that included everything from minor injuries to major trauma cases. It was exactly the kind of environment where Sarah's skills could shine, yet her colleagues seemed more focused on her personality than her performance. During lunch break, Sarah often found herself eating alone while the other nurses gathered in their usual social circles. She would pull out her phone and scroll through news articles, always staying informed about current events and military operations around the world. It was a habit she had developed during her previous career, and one that she couldn't quite shake even now that she was supposedly living a civilian life. "She's so weird," mumbled Janet, another nurse who had made no secret of her dislike for Sarah's reserved nature. "I mean, who doesn't want to be friends with her coworkers? We're here 40 hours a week together." What Janet and the others didn't know was that Sarah's definition of friendship had been forged in combat zones where trust meant survival and small talk could get you killed. She had learned to evaluate people based on their actions under pressure, not their ability to make pleasant conversation during coffee breaks. The truth was that Sarah Martinez had spent the previous 6 years as a Navy corpsman attached to SEAL Team 6. She had seen action in 3 different theaters of operation, saved more lives than she could count, and earned commendations that most people could only dream of. Her transition to civilian nursing had been part of a carefully planned exit strategy, but adjusting to the social dynamics of hospital life proved more challenging than any mission she had ever undertaken. Her medical skills had been honed in field hospitals and combat zones where resources were limited and decisions had to be made in seconds. She had performed emergency procedures under enemy fire, administered life-saving treatments in the back of moving vehicles, and coordinated medical evacuations from some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Now she was being criticized for not participating enthusiastically enough in conversations about television shows and weekend plans. The afternoon shift was particularly challenging that day. A multi-car accident had brought in several trauma patients, and the emergency department was operating at full capacity. Sarah moved through the chaos with a calm efficiency that caught the attention of everyone around her. While other nurses seemed overwhelmed by the sudden influx of critical patients, she appeared to thrive in the high-pressure environment. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, the trauma surgeon on duty, watched in amazement as Sarah anticipated his needs before he could voice them. She had supplies ready, medications prepared, and vital signs monitored with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. When a patient went into cardiac arrest, she was already positioning the defibrillator before the alarm even sounded. "How did you know?" Dr. Rodriguez asked her after they had successfully resuscitated the patient. Sarah looked at him for a moment, choosing her words carefully. His color changed, and his breathing pattern shifted. "I've seen it before." It was true, but not in the way Dr. Rodriguez imagined. She had seen it in wounded soldiers, in civilians caught in crossfire, and in fellow service members who had pushed themselves beyond their limits. Death had a particular approach that became recognizable to those who had witnessed it often enough. As the day wore on, Sarah's colleagues began to notice that their quiet, antisocial coworker was somehow managing to be everywhere she needed to be at exactly the right moment. When a child came in with severe allergic reaction, Sarah had the epinephrine ready before the doctor finished his assessment. When an elderly man arrived with chest pains, she was already setting up the EKG machine. "It's like she has radar or something," Lisa admitted grudgingly to Janet during a brief moment between patients. The reality was that Sarah's situational awareness had been developed through years of training and combat experience. She had learned to read environments, assess threats, and anticipate needs because her life and the lives of others had depended on those skills. The hospital emergency room was chaotic, but it was organized chaos compared to some of the situations she had navigated in her military career. Despite her obvious competence, the social isolation continued to wear on Sarah. She had always been more comfortable with action than words, but she was beginning to understand that her new environment required different skills. Her fellow nurses weren't bad people. They were simply operating in a world where social connection was valued differently than it had been in her previous life. That evening, as Sarah prepared to end her shift, she received a text message on her personal phone. It was from her former commanding officer, Captain James Wright, now working in a Pentagon liaison role. The message was brief, but significant. "Stay ready. Situations change quickly." Sarah deleted the message immediately, but its implications lingered in her mind. She had officially transitioned out of active duty, but she maintained security clearances and contacts that kept her connected to her former world. The message could mean anything or nothing, but it reminded her that some parts of her past might never be completely behind her. She changed out of her scrubs and into civilian clothes, same routine she had followed every day since starting at St. Mary's. As she walked through the hospital parking garage to her car, she couldn't help but notice the security cameras, the exit routes, and the potential vulnerabilities that most people would never think to observe. Old habits died hard, and some training never really faded. The drive home to her small apartment took her through downtown traffic that moved with the predictable patterns she had already memorized. Sarah's mind wandered to her teammates, scattered now across different assignments and career paths. Some had stayed in the military, others had moved into private security or law enforcement. A few, like her, had chosen completely different paths, trying to build civilian lives that felt authentic and meaningful. Her apartment was sparse, but comfortable, decorated with a few personal items that hinted at her travels without revealing too much about her background. On her bookshelf, medical texts sat alongside military histories and tactical manuals. In her closet, business casual clothing hung next to a carefully packed bag that contained items most nurses would never need, but that Sarah couldn't bring herself to completely abandon. As she prepared dinner, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. Her colleagues' criticisms stung more than she wanted to admit, but she also recognized that their expectations were reasonable within the context of their shared work environment. She had been part of teams before, incredibly tight-knit teams where trust and communication were matters of life and death. Perhaps it was time to consider whether she could find a way to build similar connections in this new environment. The next morning arrived with an early alarm and the familiar routine of preparing for another day at St. Mary's. Sarah dressed carefully, choosing her words and her attitude with the same precision she applied to everything else in her life. She had decided to make a more conscious effort to engage with her colleagues, to find some middle ground between the social butterfly they seemed to expect and the silent professional she had always been. The morning shift began like any other with the standard briefing about overnight patients and incoming cases. Sarah listened carefully, noting not just the medical information, but also the interpersonal dynamics among her colleagues. She observed who talked to whom, which nurses seemed to be natural leaders, and where the social fault lines lay within the department. During the first break in the action, she approached DR. Chun with a question about one of the patients they had treated the previous day. It was a legitimate medical inquiry, but it also represented her first attempt at initiating conversation beyond the absolute minimum required for her job. The trauma patient from yesterday, Room 12, Sarah began, her voice steady but slightly softer than her usual professional tone. I've been thinking about his presentation. Have you seen similar cases before? Dr. Chin looked surprised, but pleased by Sarah's initiative. Actually, yes. There's been an increase in those types of injuries lately. What was your assessment? For the next 10 minutes, Sarah found herself engaged in the kind of professional discussion she had always enjoyed. Medical knowledge, tactical thinking, problem solving. These were areas where she felt comfortable and confident. As they talked, she began to see a path forward that might allow her to connect with her colleagues without completely abandoning the caution and reserve that had become second nature to her. The conversation was interrupted by the familiar sound of incoming sirens, and both women immediately shifted back into emergency mode. But something had changed in that brief exchange. Dr. Chun had seen a glimpse of the intelligence and expertise that lay beneath Sarah's quiet exterior, and Sarah had remembered what it felt like to engage with another professional on topics that mattered to both of them. As the day progressed, Sarah made small but deliberate efforts to participate more actively in the team dynamics around her. She offered suggestions during patient discussions, shared observations that proved valuable, and even managed a few brief exchanges that verged on friendly conversation. It wasn't dramatic transformation, but it was a beginning. Her colleagues noticed the change, and their responses were mixed. Some, like Dr. Chun, seemed pleased to discover that the quiet new nurse had depth and expertise they hadn't recognized. Others remained skeptical, viewing her sudden participation as calculated rather than genuine. Sarah understood their perspective and accepted that building trust would take time. What none of them could have predicted was that time was about to become a luxury they couldn't afford. The morning of Sarah's 4th week at St. Mary's began with an unusual tension in the air. Dr. Chun arrived earlier than usual, her expression serious as she reviewed overnight reports. The emergency department had been unusually quiet, which in Sarah's experience often meant that chaos was building somewhere just out of sight. "Did you hear about the situation downtown?" Lisa asked Janet as they prepared for the day's shift. "Something about a security alert at the federal building." Sarah's attention sharpened immediately. Federal building security alerts could mean anything from a suspicious package to something far more serious. She glanced at her phone discreetly, checking news feeds and emergency services channels that most civilians wouldn't think to monitor. The information was limited, but what she found made her pulse quicken slightly. Reports were vague, mentioning only that federal authorities were responding to an ongoing situation that required the evacuation of several government buildings in the downtown area. The hospital was located less than 2 miles from the federal complex, close enough that any major incident could quickly impact their operations. "Probably just another bomb scare," Janet said dismissively. "Seems like that happens every few months now." Sarah didn't respond, but her mind was already shifting into the analytical mode that had served her well during her military service. Bomb scares were often exactly that, scares, but sometimes they weren't, and the difference between preparation and panic could determine how many people lived or died. The first indication that this situation was different came when Dr. Rodriguez arrived at the hospital 40 minutes early, his face grim and his phone pressed to his ear. Sarah watched as he spoke in low, urgent tones with someone who was clearly providing him with information that wasn't available to the general public. "All hands meeting in 5 minutes," Dr. Rodriguez announced to the emergency department staff. "Something's developing downtown, and we need to be ready." The meeting was brief, but serious. Dr. Rodriguez explained that federal authorities were dealing with what they described as a credible threat to multiple government buildings in the downtown area. The nature of the threat wasn't specified, but hospitals in the region have been advised to prepare for potential casualties and to implement their mass casualty protocols. "We don't know what we're dealing with yet," Dr. Rodriguez said, his voice steady but concerned. "But we need to be ready for anything. Check your emergency supplies, review your procedures, and stay alert for updates." Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the mixture of adrenaline and focus that had always preceded challenging missions. Around her, her colleagues were displaying various levels of concern and confusion, but she recognized the signs of a situation that was likely to escalate quickly. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, but the code format was immediately recognizable to anyone with her background. The message read, "Asset proximity confirmed. Maintain readiness." Sarah deleted the message immediately, but its implications were clear. Someone with access to classified information knew where she was and believed her skills might be needed. The fact that they were making contact through unofficial channels suggested that whatever was happening downtown was serious enough to activate contingency protocols. The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. The emergency department continued its normal operations, but everyone was aware that the calm could be shattered at any moment. Sarah moved through her routine tasks with increased vigilance, noting exit routes, supply locations, and communication equipment that might become critical in an emergency situation. At 10:47 a.m., the first indication of serious trouble came through the hospital's emergency communication system. Dr. Rodriguez received a call from the city's Emergency Coordination Center, and his expression immediately shifted from concern to alarmed. "We have multiple casualties incoming," he announced to the assembled staff. "Unknown number, unknown types of injuries. ETA 15 minutes. This is not a drill." The emergency department transformed instantly from a medical facility into a combat zone. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, clearing beds, preparing equipment, and establishing triage areas. Sarah watched her colleagues work and recognized competence and professionalism that reminded her of military medical units she had worked with. But she also noticed things that her colleagues missed. The specific medical supplies that were being requested suggested blast injuries and possible chemical exposure. The security protocols being implemented indicated that authorities believed the threat was ongoing, not resolved. Most significantly, the communication patterns she was monitoring suggested that multiple agencies were coordinating a response to something much larger than a simple terrorist incident. The first ambulance arrived exactly 15 minutes after Dr. Rodriguez's announcement. The paramedics who brought in the patient were professional, but clearly shaken by what they had witnessed. The patient was a federal security officer with blast injuries and chemical burns that indicated exposure to something significantly more dangerous than conventional explosives. "What happened out there?" Dr. Chin asked the lead paramedic as they transferred the patient to a trauma bay. "We're not supposed to say," the paramedic replied, but his expression conveyed volumes. "But you need to know that this isn't over. There are more coming, and some of them are in really bad shape." As Sarah helped prepare the patient for treatment, she noticed details that confirmed her growing suspicions about the nature of the incident. The officer's injuries were consistent with exposure to military-grade chemical weapons, not the crude devices typically associated with domestic terrorism. His equipment and uniform showed blast patterns that suggested a coordinated attack using sophisticated weaponry. The second wave of casualties arrived 30 minutes later, and the picture became even clearer. Multiple federal agents, some with blast injuries and others with symptoms of chemical exposure. 2 civilians who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And 1 individual whose injuries and equipment suggested he was part of whatever force had initiated the attack. Dr. Rodriguez called for additional staff and activated the hospital's mass casualty protocols. The emergency department was operating at capacity, and every available medical professional was pressed into service. Sarah found herself assigned to triage, evaluating incoming patients and determining treatment priorities. It was work she had done before, but under very different circumstances. In combat zones, medical personnel operated with the understanding that they were part of a larger military operation. Here, she was supposed to be a civilian nurse working in a civilian hospital, but the nature of the casualties made it clear that the line between military and civilian operations had been blurred. The third wave of arrivals changed everything. Among the casualties was a federal agent who recognized Sarah immediately, despite her civilian nursing uniform and hospital identification badge. His injuries were serious, but not life-threatening, and when he saw her approaching a stretcher, his expression shifted from pain to recognition to something approaching relief. "Martinez," he said, his voice strained but certain. Petty Officer Martinez from SEAL Team 6? Sarah's blood went cold. She glanced around quickly to see if anyone else had heard, but the chaos of the emergency department had masked the conversation. Dr. Chin was 3 beds away, focused on a patient with critical injuries. Lisa and Janet were across the room, dealing with their own cases. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but her mind racing. "I'm just a nurse here." "No way," the agent continued, his voice gaining strength despite his injuries. "I know who you are. You were at that extraction in Syria 2 years ago. You saved Lieutenant Morrison's life when his helicopter went down." Sarah felt the careful life she had built at St. Mary's beginning to crumble around her. She had known this moment might come eventually, but she had hoped for more time to establish her civilian identity before her past caught up with her. "You need to let me treat your injuries," she said firmly, hoping to redirect his attention. "You have chemical burns that require immediate attention." But the agent was persistent. "Martinez, whatever you're doing here, whatever cover you're maintaining, you need to know that this situation is bigger than what they're telling the hospital staff. The people who did this aren't ordinary terrorists. They have military training, military equipment, and they're still active." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She began treating his injuries while simultaneously processing the intelligence he was providing. Chemical burns from military-grade weapons, multiple coordinated attacks on federal facilities, an ongoing threat with military capabilities. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a picture that she didn't like. "How many?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the chaos around them. "At least 6, maybe more. They hit 3 buildings simultaneously, using tactics that suggest special forces training. We think they're foreign operatives, but we can't be sure. What we do know is that they're still out there, and they're planning something bigger." Sarah's mind immediately shifted into tactical mode. Multiple coordinated attacks suggested a well-planned operation with specific objectives. The use of chemical weapons indicated access to resources that went beyond typical terrorist capabilities. Most importantly, if the attackers were still active, the hospital itself could become a target. "Does anyone here know about your background?" the agent asked, wincing as Sarah cleaned his wounds. "No," Sarah replied, grateful that her colleagues had been too focused on criticizing her personality to investigate her professional history. "Good. Keep it that way. But, Martinez, if this situation escalates, if they need someone with your skills..." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Sarah finished treating his injuries in silence, her mind working through possibilities and contingencies she had hoped never to consider in her civilian life. Around her, the emergency department continued its vital work, her colleagues unaware that one of their own possessed capabilities that might soon be desperately needed. As she moved to the next patient, Sarah noticed Dr. Chun watching her with a curious expression. The interaction with the federal agent had lasted longer than usual, and Sarah's demeanor during the conversation had been different from her typical professional detachment. "Everything okay with that patient?" Dr. Chun asked when Sarah passed her station. "Chemical burns, but stable," Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral. He was asking about his colleagues. It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Sarah was discovering that maintaining her cover story was becoming increasingly difficult as the situation developed. Each new piece of information she gathered painted a picture of a threat that was beyond the capabilities of civilian law enforcement to handle effectively. The fourth wave of casualties included 2 individuals who immediately caught Sarah's attention. Their injuries were minimal, but their behavior and equipment suggested they were not victims of the attack. They were federal agents of some kind, but not FBI or Secret Service. Their gear and demeanor suggested something more specialized, possibly military or intelligence operatives. One of them, a woman in her mid-30s with short dark hair and alert eyes, scanned the emergency department with the same systematic attention to detail that Sarah had been taught to employ in potentially hostile environments. When her gaze settled on Sarah, there was a moment of mutual recognition between two professionals who had been trained in similar disciplines. Dr. Rodriguez was called away to handle a new crisis, and, for a brief moment, the specialized agent approached Sarah's station. "Nurse Martinez," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that had nothing to do with her supposed patient status. "Yes," Sarah replied, her own voice carefully neutral. "I think we need to talk. Privately." Sarah glanced around the emergency department. Her colleagues were still fully engaged with the ongoing medical crisis, and the chaos provided perfect cover for a brief conversation that wouldn't attract attention. "Supply closet 3. 2 minutes," Sarah said quietly. The agent nodded and moved away, maintaining her cover as a patient while positioning herself near the designated meeting location. Sarah finished with her current patient and made her way to the supply closet, her mind racing through the implications of what was clearly an intelligence contact. The conversation that followed lasted less than 5 minutes, but it changed everything Sarah thought she knew about her situation and her future. Inside the supply closet, Sarah found herself face to face with Agent Maria Santos from the Defense Intelligence Agency. The woman's credentials were impeccable, and her knowledge of Sarah's background was disturbingly comprehensive. Petty Officer First Class Sarah Elena Martinez. Agent Santos began, her voice low but urgent. 6 years Navy Special Operations, 3 combat deployments, Silver Star, Purple Heart, and medical training that makes you one of the most qualified combat medics in the country. Sarah's jaw tightened. "I'm a civilian now. I work here as a registered nurse." "Your discharge papers say inactive reserve," Santos corrected, "which means you can be reactivated if national security requires it. And right now it does." Through the thin walls of the supply closet, Sarah could hear the ongoing chaos of the emergency department. Her colleagues were working frantically to treat casualties from an attack that she was beginning to understand was far more serious than anyone at the hospital realized. "The people who hit the federal buildings this morning aren't ordinary terrorists," Santos continued. "They're a team of highly trained operatives with access to military-grade chemical weapons. Intelligence suggests they're part of a larger cell that's been planning something catastrophic." "What does this have to do with me?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 3 of the attackers were injured in the operation. Our sources indicate they're planning to target this hospital to retrieve their wounded and eliminate witnesses. They know federal agents are being treated here, and they have intelligence about our response capabilities. Sarah felt her stomach drop. We estimate they'll move within the next 2 hours. Probably during the shift change when security is naturally reduced and there's maximum confusion. The implications were staggering. St. Mary's Hospital was not designed to withstand a military-style assault. The security staff consisted of 2 guards who were trained to handle drunk patients and petty theft, not armed operatives with special forces training. "What about evacuation?" Sarah asked. "Not possible. We have too many critical patients, including some who can't be moved without risking their lives. Plus, evacuating would signal to the attackers that we know they're coming, which could cause them to escalate their timeline or change their target to something even worse." Santos reached into her jacket and produced a small communication device. "This connects you directly to our tactical team. They're positioning themselves around the hospital now, but they need someone inside who can coordinate with medical staff and provide intelligence about the building's layout and vulnerabilities. Sarah stared at the device, understanding that accepting it would mean abandoning the civilian life she had worked so hard to build. But she also understood that refusing it could mean the death of every person in the hospital, including her colleagues who had spent weeks complaining about her antisocial behavior. "My cover will be blown," Sarah said. "Probably. But if we don't stop these people here, your cover won't matter because you'll be dead along with everyone else." The supply closet door opened suddenly, and Dr. Chun appeared in the doorway. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion as she took in the scene before her. "Sarah, is everything all right? You've been gone for 10 minutes, and we need you out here." Sarah and Santos exchanged a quick glance. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than expected. "Dr. Chun," Sarah said carefully, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and I need you to trust me even though it's going to sound impossible." Over the next 5 minutes, Sarah revealed the truth about her background to her supervisor, while Agent Santos provided additional details about the threat facing the hospital. Dr. Chin's expression shifted from disbelief to shock to grim understanding as the full scope of the situation became clear. "So you're telling me that the quiet, antisocial nurse I've been working with for 3 weeks is actually some kind of Navy SEAL?" Dr. Chun said. "Combat medic attached to SEAL teams," Sarah corrected. "And yes, and foreign operatives are planning to attack our hospital." "That's the intelligence we have," Santos confirmed. Dr. Chun was quiet for a long moment, processing information that challenged everything she thought she knew about her workplace and her colleague. Finally, she spoke. "What do you need from me?" The next hour was a masterclass in crisis management and deception. Working with Dr. Chun and Agent Santos, Sarah began implementing security measures while maintaining the appearance of normal hospital operations. The key was to prepare for the attack without creating panic among staff or patients. Dr. Chun discreetly contacted Dr. Rodriguez and the hospital administrator, sharing carefully selected details about the security threat. The official story was that law enforcement had received intelligence about a possible attempt to target federal agents being treated at the hospital, and that additional security measures were being implemented as a precaution. Meanwhile, Sarah used her access to hospital systems to map out defensive positions, identify potential escape routes, and catalog available supplies that could be used for protection or medical treatment during an assault. Her military training allowed her to see the building in tactical terms that her civilian colleagues never would have considered. The communication device Santos had provided connected her to a joint task force that included FBI, ATF, and military special operations personnel. The team leader was someone Sarah recognized from her previous service, Master Chief Petty Officer David Park, who had worked with her during a particularly challenging operation in Afghanistan. "Martinez, this is Park. Good to have you on the inside. What's your assessment?" Sarah spoke quietly into the device while appearing to check medical supplies. "Building has multiple vulnerabilities. Main entrance, emergency department entrance, and service entrances on the north and east sides. Security staff is minimal and not equipped for military-level threat. Medical staff is competent, but has no tactical training." "Copy that. We have teams positioned at all entrances, but we're going to need your help coordinating if they breach the building. Can you handle that without compromising the medical mission?" "Affirmative." Dr. Chun is aware of the situation and is cooperating fully. As Sarah continued her conversation with the tactical team, she became aware that Lisa and Janet were watching her with increasing curiosity. Her behavior had changed noticeably over the past hour, and her colleagues were beginning to notice details they had previously overlooked. Who is she talking to? Janet whispered to Lisa. And why is she suddenly acting like she's in charge of everything? Sarah realized that maintaining her cover was becoming impossible. Her military training was overriding her civilian persona, and the transformation was becoming obvious to anyone who cared to look. Soon she would have to make a choice between operational security and personal relationships. That choice was made for her when the first attack came earlier than expected. At 2:15 p.m., during what should have been a routine shift change, 3 individuals entered the hospital through the main entrance. They were dressed as emergency medical technicians, complete with official-looking credentials and equipment. To the untrained eye, they appear to be legitimate first responders bringing in another casualty from the downtown incident. But Sarah recognized them immediately. Their movement patterns, their equipment positioning, and their coordinated timing all indicated military training. More importantly, she could see the concealed weapons that were hidden beneath their EMT uniforms. "Code Silver," Sarah said quietly into her communication device, using the hospital security alert code for armed intruders. Around the emergency department, Sarah's colleagues continued their work, unaware that 3 armed operatives were moving through the hospital corridors toward their location. The attackers were professional enough to avoid immediate confrontation, instead positioning themselves for maximum effectiveness when they revealed their true purpose. Sarah caught Dr. Chen's eye and nodded toward the main entrance. Dr. Chen followed her gaze and immediately understood the situation. Without drawing attention to herself, she began moving toward the secured medication area where a silent alarm could be activated. The lead attacker, a man in his mid-30s with a build and bearing of a Special Forces soldier, approached the reception desk and asked about the federal agents who had been brought in earlier. His English was fluent, but carried a slight accent that Sarah couldn't immediately place. "I need to check on the condition of the officers from this morning's incident," he told the receptionist. "We're with the Emergency Response Coordination Unit." The receptionist, unaware of the developing situation, began providing information about patient locations and treatment status. Sarah realized she had perhaps 30 seconds before the attackers would have enough information to begin their assault. Moving with a speed and precision that had kept her alive in combat zones, Sarah activated the emergency lockdown procedures for the emergency department while simultaneously signaling the tactical team outside. The hospital security protocols were designed to contain dangerous patients, but they would also work to limit the attackers' movement once they revealed their intentions. The lead attacker noticed the subtle changes in the department's status almost immediately. His eyes scanned the area and settled on Sarah, who was moving with purpose that didn't match her supposed role as a nurse. For a moment, the two of them stared at each other across the busy emergency department. Both were experienced operatives who recognized a threat when they saw one. Both understood that the next few seconds would determine whether the situation escalated into violence or remained contained. The attacker's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, and Sarah knew that the time for subtlety had passed. "Gun!" she shouted, diving toward Dr. Chun, while simultaneously triggering the hospital's mass emergency alert system. The emergency department erupted into chaos as medical staff and patients suddenly realized they were in the middle of an armed assault. The 3 attackers abandoned their pretense and drew weapons, but they found themselves facing a prepared opposition that included both hospital security and federal tactical teams that had been positioned around the building. Sarah's colleagues stared in shock as their quiet, antisocial co-worker transformed before their eyes into someone they didn't recognize. She moved with combat efficiency, directing evacuation procedures and coordinating with tactical teams through communication equipment that had appeared from nowhere. "Sarah," Lisa called out in confusion and fear as bullets began flying across the emergency department. "Stay down," Sarah shouted back, her voice carrying an authority that none of her colleagues had ever heard before. "Follow evacuation protocol, Charlie, and move to the secure areas." The battle for St. Mary's Hospital had begun, and Sarah Martinez was no longer just a nurse. The gunfire that erupted in St. Mary's emergency department was unlike anything the medical staff had ever experienced. Sarah watched as her colleagues dove for cover behind medical equipment and patient beds, their faces showing terror and confusion as their safe workplace became a battlefield. The three attackers were professionals who had clearly planned their assault carefully. They moved with coordinated precision, using the hospital's layout to their advantage while attempting to reach the federal agents who were being treated in the secure section of the emergency department. Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. While her colleagues scrambled for safety, she assessed the tactical situation with the calm efficiency that had kept her alive in much worse circumstances. The attackers had superior firepower, but they were operating in an unfamiliar environment against an opposition that included federal tactical teams and someone they hadn't expected to encounter. "Martinez, this is Park," came the voice through her communication device. "We have eyes on 3 hostiles inside your location. Can you provide status on civilians?" "Approximately 20 medical staff and 15 patients in the emergency department," Sarah replied, while helping Dr. Chen move patients away from the line of fire. "Most are taking cover, but we have several critical patients who can't be moved quickly." The lead attacker was advancing toward the trauma bays where the federal agents were being treated. He moved with the disciplined aggression of someone who had received extensive military training, using cover effectively while maintaining awareness of multiple threats. Sarah realized that her position near the central nursing station gave her a clear view of the attacker's approach route. More importantly, it positioned her to intercept him before he could reach the vulnerable patients and medical staff in the trauma area. "I'm going to need medical supplies," she told Dr. Chen quietly. "Emergency surgery kit for medications, and anything we can use for trauma treatment." "Sarah, what are you planning?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice strained with stress and confusion. "Something I hoped I'd never have to do again." Moving with practiced stealth, Sarah began working her way around the perimeter of the emergency department. Her civilian nursing uniform provided perfect camouflage, allowing her to move through the chaos without immediately attracting the attacker's attention. The second attacker had positioned himself near the main entrance, preventing evacuation while maintaining communication with his team members. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation in what she now recognized as Russian, confirming her suspicion that this was a foreign operation with sophisticated backing. As she moved, Sarah began implementing tactics she had learned in urban warfare training. She used medical equipment as improvised barriers, created distraction points that would divide the attacker's attention, and identified strategic positions where she could engage them effectively. The first opportunity came when the lead attacker paused to reload his weapon. Sarah had positioned herself behind a mobile X-ray machine that provided cover while giving her a clear angle of approach. Moving with the silent precision that had been drilled into her during special operations training, she closed the distance between them in less than 5 seconds. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brief but intense. The attacker was skilled and well-trained, but he wasn't expecting to face someone with Sarah's specific combination of medical knowledge and combat experience. She used pressure points and anatomical knowledge to disable him quickly while minimizing the risk of collateral damage to nearby patients and staff. One down, she reported through her communication device while securing the attacker's weapon and checking him for additional threats. Outstanding work, Martinez. Park's voice crackled through the device. We're moving to engage the other two. Can you provide overwatch from your position? Sarah looked around the emergency department and realized that her colleagues were staring at her in complete shock. Lisa and Janet were huddled behind a medication cart, their mouths open as they watched their quiet coworker efficiently handle military equipment and coordinate with tactical teams. Sarah, Dr. Chin called out, her voice filled with amazement and disbelief. What the hell just happened? Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching helicopters became audible over the chaos of the ongoing firefight. But these weren't police or medical helicopters. The distinctive sound signature indicated military aircraft, and Sarah recognized the specific engine pattern immediately. Park, are you expecting air support? She asked into her communication device. Negative. All our assets are ground-based. What are you seeing? Sarah moved to a window and looked up at the sky. What she saw made her blood run cold. Two military-style helicopters were approaching the hospital, their markings obscured and their flight patterns indicating tactical rather than rescue operations. We have incoming hostiles, she reported. Military helicopters, probably insertion vehicles for additional assault teams. The situation had just escalated from a hospital attack to a full-scale military operation. Sarah realized that the three attackers inside the building had been just the advance team designed to secure the target and prepare for a larger force that was now arriving. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been coordinating the medical response from a secure location, appeared at Sarah's position with a look of desperate determination. Sarah, I don't know who you really are, but it's clear you know how to handle this situation, he said. We have 60 patients in this hospital who can't be moved. Whatever you need from us, whatever you need us to do, just tell us. Sarah looked around at her colleagues, who were waiting for direction from someone they had underestimated and misunderstood for weeks. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same people who had criticized her for being antisocial were now looking to her for leadership in the most social crisis imaginable. Dr. Rodriguez, I need you to coordinate patient movement to the most secure areas of the hospital, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Dr. Chun, work with hospital security to establish defensive positions at critical access points. Everyone else, follow their directions and stay away from windows and exterior walls. As her colleagues began implementing her instructions, Sarah contacted the tactical team outside. Park, we're about to have company, she reported. I count at least a dozen additional operatives in those helicopters. They're going to try to establish a perimeter around the building and then assault from multiple directions. Copy that. We're calling in additional support, but it's going to take time. Can you hold your position? Sarah looked around the emergency department, taking in the medical equipment, the layout, and the people she was responsible for protecting. It wasn't the battlefield she had trained for, but it was the battlefield she had been given. Affirmative. We'll hold. The next phase of the battle began when the helicopters landed in the hospital parking lot and disgorged two teams of heavily armed operatives. Sarah watched through the window as they moved with military precision, establishing firing positions and preparing for a coordinated assault on the building. But something unexpected happened as the attackers moved into position. The distinctive sound of additional helicopters became audible, but these aircraft had a different engine signature, one that Sarah recognized with a mixture of relief and amazement. Martinez, this is Reaper 6, came a new voice through her communication device. We understand you have a situation that requires immediate assistance. Sarah's heart stopped. Reaper 6 was the call sign for SEAL Team 6, her former unit. Someone with serious authority had decided that this situation warranted the deployment of America's most elite special operations force. Through the window, she watched as Navy helicopters appeared over the hospital, disgorging teams of operators who moved with a precision and coordination that made the attackers' military training look amateurish by comparison. Martinez, this is Commander Harrison, came another voice, one she recognized immediately. We're here to extract you and secure the hospital. What's your status? Commander Harrison had been her commanding officer during her final deployment, and his presence indicated that this operation had been escalated to the highest levels of military command. I'm secure and operational inside the emergency department, Sarah reported. Civilian medical staff are in defensive positions, and we have multiple critical patients who cannot be moved. Understood. We're going to neutralize the external threats and then coordinate with you for interior clearing operations. As Sarah watched through the window, the battle outside shifted dramatically. The foreign operatives found themselves facing an enemy they were not prepared for, elite American Special Operations Forces with superior training, equipment, and tactical support. But inside the hospital, Sarah's colleagues were dealing with a different kind of shock. The revelation that their quiet, antisocial coworker was connected to the most elite military units in the country was challenging everything they thought they knew about her. Sarah, Lisa said, her voice filled with awe and confusion. Who are you really? Sarah looked at her colleagues, people who had spent weeks questioning her social skills and professional commitment. Now they were looking at her as if she were a completely different person, which in many ways she was. I'm exactly who I said I was, Sarah replied. I'm a registered nurse who works here. But I'm also someone who used to do a very different kind of job, and sometimes that past catches up with you in ways you don't expect. The sound of gunfire outside was diminishing as the SEAL teams systematically neutralized the attacking force. Sarah could hear the distinctive patterns of American military tactics being employed with devastating effectiveness. But the most challenging part of the day was still ahead of her. The immediate threat was being handled by professionals who were better equipped for that kind of work than she was. Now she had to figure out how to rebuild relationships with colleagues who had discovered that their understanding of her was completely wrong. Dr. Chen approached her as the sounds of combat outside began to fade. Sarah, I owe you an apology, she said. We all do. We judged you based on our expectations instead of trying to understand who you really were. You don't owe me anything, Sarah replied. I chose to keep that part of my life private. I wanted to be just a nurse here. And now? Sarah looked around the emergency department, taking in the evidence of the battle they had just survived. Medical equipment was damaged, windows were shattered, and the carefully organized space had been transformed into something that looked more like a combat aid station than a civilian hospital. Now I don't know, she admitted. Some things change everything, and you can't go back to the way they were before. The aftermath of the battle at St. Mary's Hospital unfolded with the methodical precision of a military operation transitioning to civilian control. Within an hour of the SEAL team's arrival, the parking lot had been secured, the injured attackers were in custody, and federal investigators were beginning the complex process of understanding how foreign operatives had managed to coordinate such a sophisticated assault on American soil. Sarah stood in the emergency department, watching as her colleagues slowly emerged from their defensive positions. The space that had been their workplace just hours earlier now looked like a disaster zone, with overturned equipment, shattered glass, and the unmistakable evidence of combat scattered throughout the area. Commander Harrison approached her, his expression serious but relieved. Sarah had served under his command for 2 years, and she could read the mixture of professional respect and personal concern in his demeanor. "Martinez, are you injured?" he asked, conducting the same medical assessment she had seen him perform countless times in combat zones. "Negative, sir. Minor cuts from glass, but nothing that requires immediate attention." "And the hospital staff?" Sarah looked around at her colleagues, who were emerging from cover with expressions of shock, relief, and something approaching awe. No serious injuries among medical personnel. The patients in critical condition remained stable throughout the engagement. Commander Harrison nodded, then lowered his voice to speak more privately. "This operation is going to require extensive debriefing. There are going to be questions about how these operatives knew to target this specific hospital, how they obtained intelligence about federal agents being treated here, and how they managed to coordinate such a sophisticated assault." Sarah understood the implications. The attack on St. Mary's hadn't been a random target of opportunity. It had been a carefully planned operation that suggested intelligence gathering and planning capabilities that went far beyond typical terrorist organizations. "Sir, what does this mean for my status here?" she asked. Commander Harrison was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "That's going to depend on a lot of factors that are above both our pay grades. But, Martinez, what you did here today probably saved dozens of lives. That's not going to go unnoticed." As Commander Harrison moved away to coordinate with other officials, Sarah found herself surrounded by her colleagues. The same people who had spent weeks questioning her social skills and professional commitment were now looking at her with expressions ranging from amazement to gratitude to something approaching reverence. Dr. Chun was the first to speak. "Sarah, I think I speak for everyone when I say that we owe you our lives. If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't recognized what was happening and coordinated our response, any of you would have done the same thing in my position," Sarah replied, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. Her specific training and experience had been critical to their survival. "No," Dr. Rodriguez said firmly. "We wouldn't have because we couldn't have. What you did today required skills and experience that none of the rest of us possess." Lisa approached hesitantly, her expression showing embarrassment and remorse. "Sarah, I need to apologize. We spent weeks judging you for being antisocial and not participating in our conversations. We never tried to understand why you might be more reserved than the rest of us." "You couldn't have known," Sarah said gently. "I chose not to share that part of my background. But we should have respected your privacy instead of making you feel like there was something wrong with you," Janet added. "We turned your professionalism into a character flaw when we should have recognized it for what it was." The conversation was interrupted by Agent Santos, who approached with a tablet full of forms and official documentation. The bureaucratic aftermath of the morning's events was already beginning, and Sarah recognized the familiar process of transitioning from operational action to administrative review. "Petty Officer Martinez," Santos began, then corrected herself. "I'm sorry, Nurse Martinez. We're going to need to conduct extensive interviews about today's events, and there are going to be some decisions that need to be made about your status and your future assignments." Sarah nodded, understanding that her carefully constructed civilian life was probably over. The exposure of her background to both her colleagues and federal investigators meant that maintaining her cover as a simple hospital nurse was no longer feasible. But as she looked around at her colleagues, Sarah realized something unexpected had happened. For the first time since arriving at St. Mary's, she felt like she belonged. not because she had hidden her true identity, but because she had been forced to reveal it in service of protecting the people she worked with. Whatever happens with the federal investigation, Dr. Chun said, I want you to know that you have a place here for as long as you want it. Your skills, both medical and otherwise, make you an invaluable member of our team. Assuming I'm allowed to continue working in a civilian capacity, Sarah replied. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward. Sarah, I've been thinking about what happened here today, and I have a proposal. St. Mary's is located in an area where we regularly treat federal agents, military personnel, and civilians who work in high-risk occupations. We've never had anyone on our staff with your specific combination of medical training and security experience. Sarah looked at him curiously, wondering where he was leading the conversation. I think we should create a new position, Dr. Rodriguez continued. Emergency Department Security Liaison. Someone who can coordinate with law enforcement and federal agencies, provide security assessments, and ensure that our medical staff are prepared for situations that go beyond typical hospital emergencies. The proposal was intriguing, but Sarah wasn't sure it was realistic. Dr. Rodriguez, I appreciate the thought, but that kind of position would require federal approval and probably ongoing security clearances, which you already have, Agent Santos interjected, and which the federal government would very much like to see utilized in a constructive way. Sarah realized that a path was being offered to her that would allow her to maintain her medical career while acknowledging and utilizing her military background. It wouldn't be the quiet, anonymous civilian life she had originally planned, but it might be something better. Over the next several hours, as federal investigators conducted their interviews and began the process of understanding the full scope of the morning's events, Sarah's colleagues made a point of including her in conversations and decisions in a way they never had before. The change wasn't just about gratitude or respect, though both of those emotions were clearly present. It was about recognition. For the first time, her colleagues saw her as a complete person rather than a puzzle they couldn't solve or a coworker who didn't fit their expectations. Lisa approached her during a brief break in the interviews. Sarah, I have to ask, was it hard to pretend to be someone you weren't? I wasn't pretending to be someone I wasn't, Sarah replied thoughtfully. I'm a nurse. I chose this profession because I wanted to help people, and I'm good at it. The military training was part of my background, but it wasn't the sum total of who I am. But you must have felt frustrated when we criticized you for being antisocial. Sarah considered the question carefully. It was challenging, yes, but you weren't wrong to value social connection and teamwork. Those are important qualities in any workplace. I just approached them differently because of my background. How do you mean? In military operations, trust is built through demonstrated competence under pressure, not through casual conversation. I was comfortable working alongside all of you, but I was waiting to see how we functioned as a team when it really mattered. Lisa was quiet for a moment, processing this perspective. And now you know? Sarah looked around the emergency department, taking in the sight of her colleagues working together to restore their workspace and care for patients despite the trauma they had all experienced. She saw Dr. Chen coordinating with hospital administration to ensure continued patient care. She watched Dr. Rodriguez managing the complex logistics of maintaining hospital operations during a federal investigation. She observed Janet and Lisa supporting each other through the emotional aftermath of their first experience with violence. Now I know, Sarah confirmed, and I'm proud to work with all of you. The federal investigation would continue for weeks, but the preliminary findings suggested that the attack on St. Mary's had been part of a larger operation designed to test American response capabilities and gather intelligence about federal law enforcement procedures. The fact that it had been thwarted by an unexpected combination of civilian medical staff and military special operations forces had apparently disrupted much larger plans. As for Sarah's future, the proposal for a security liaison position moved forward with surprising speed. Federal agencies were eager to place someone with her capabilities in a position where she could serve as an early warning system for similar threats while maintaining her medical credentials and civilian status. 3 weeks later, Sarah Martinez officially became St. Mary's Hospital's first emergency department security liaison, a position that combined her nursing duties with responsibility for coordinating with federal agencies and providing security assessments for the medical facility. Her new office was located adjacent to the emergency department, equipped with communication systems that would have been familiar to her from her military service, but that allowed her to maintain her role as a medical professional. The arrangement satisfied federal security requirements while giving Sarah the civilian career she wanted. But the most significant change was in her relationships with her colleagues. The social barriers that had existed before were gone, replaced by mutual respect and genuine friendship. Her colleagues no longer saw her reserve as antisocial behavior, but as the natural caution of someone whose previous experiences had taught her the value of careful observation. Dr. Chin stopped by Sarah's new office on her first official day in the security liaison role. "So how does it feel to finally be yourself at work?" Sarah looked up from her computer, where she was reviewing security protocols and emergency response procedures. "It feels like I don't have to choose between being a nurse and being someone with military experience. I can be both. And the team dynamic? Better than I expected. When people understand why you approach things differently, they're more likely to value what you bring to the table instead of criticizing you for not being like everyone else." Through her office window, Sarah could see the emergency department where she had worked for just over a month. It looked completely normal now, with no evidence of the battle that had taken place there. But she knew that everyone who had been present that day had been changed by the experience. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Commander Harrison. "Outstanding work, Martinez. The Navy is proud of your service, both past and present." Sarah smiled as she deleted the message. She had found a way to honor both her military service and her civilian aspirations, while building the kind of professional relationships she had always wanted but never known how to create. That evening, as she prepared to leave for the day, Lisa approached her with an invitation that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier. "Sarah, a few of us are going out for drinks after work. Want to join us?" For the first time since arriving at St. Mary's, Sarah accepted the invitation without hesitation. She had learned that being part of a team didn't require abandoning her identity or compromising her values. It simply required being authentic about who she was and allowing others to understand and appreciate her unique contributions. As she walked out of the hospital that evening with her colleagues, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. She had come to St. Mary's hoping to disappear into a quiet civilian life, but instead she had found something better, a place where she could be entirely herself while serving others in a way that honored both her military experience and her medical calling. The laughter and conversation that surrounded her as they headed to their evening plans was genuine and comfortable, built on mutual respect and shared experience rather than superficial social expectations. It was exactly the kind of professional relationship she had always wanted but never thought possible in a civilian environment. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the best way to find where you belong is to stop trying to be someone you're not and simply be the best version of who you already are.